Good afternoon and welcome to today's Oxford Union event. We are honoured today to be joined by Professor Joseph Nye. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Professor Nye. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be back at the Oxford Union, even though it's only virtual. It's always enjoyable to be with Oxford students. Let me say a few words about morality and foreign policy. And I'll basically describe this new book that I've just written, Do Morals Matter? With a question mark in the title, Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. And then after a few basic ideas from that, we can have our discussion. When people, or a friend in particular, asked me what I was writing a few years back, and I told her that I was going to write a book called Do Morals Matter in Foreign Policy, her quip was, well, good, at least it'll be a brief book. And that really is the conventional wisdom, that morals don't matter very much in foreign policy, that foreign policy is the realm of national interest, and that you don't think of moral interests at all. In other words, if you put it in a metaphor, if foreign policy is a cake, it's interests that bake the cake. And politicians just come along and sprinkle some morality on it, a bit like icing to make it look pretty, but it's not really a key ingredient. Indeed, when I was working in the State Department, when I was on leave from Harvard, I was dealing with a French diplomat. We were negotiating issues related to nuclear weapons. And at dinner after our tough day of negotiation, I asked him, do you ever worry about the moral implications of what we're dealing with? And his reaction was, no, there is no morality. The only thing that matters is the interests of France. And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. But in any case, that is the conventional wisdom. So the purpose of the book is twofold. One is to look at American presidents since 1945 and see whether in little historical vignettes of the 14 presidents, it made a difference to history what their moral views were. And I show the answer to that is yes. In some cases, it made a very big difference. I'll illustrate that in a minute. But then the second purpose of the book is if we've demonstrated that morals matter, then how should we think about them? And that's where I'll go after this little historical vignette. But the best example of morals mattering is the case of Harry Truman. Harry Truman, of course, is often looked back upon as a man who failed the moral test by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, Truman was offered an honorary degree at Oxford in 1948. And Elizabeth Anscombe, who was then a very well-known Oxford moral philosopher, refused to attend the ceremony on the grounds that she could never come to a ceremony honoring anybody who killed so many women and children. But the story is more complicated than that. And I try to show this in the book. Truman, when he dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, felt that he was shortening the war. He was told that he would save a lot of lives. And he didn't think, as he put it, that he needed to lose sleep over it. On the other hand, people don't realize or don't remember there was a third bomb, which was on Tinian Island in the South Pacific, which was ready to be used. And Truman told the military that no, he was not going to use that bomb. And the reason was he was not going to kill that many more women and children. In other words, once he saw the effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he said, that's enough. Perhaps even more important, 5 years later, Truman was bogged down in the Korean War. Remember, the North Koreans had crossed the 38th parallel into the south. The Americans with the UN contingent pushed back up to the north of the peninsula. The Chinese then crossed the Yalu River and pushed the Americans back down the peninsula. And it looked like the war was about to be lost or a stalemate. General Douglas MacArthur, who was the American commander in the region at the time, said to Truman, if you allow me to drop 20 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, I will win this war for you. Otherwise, it's lost. And Truman knew that if he lost the war, that was the end of his presidency or his political chances for another term. But he told MacArthur no, he was not going to kill that many more women and children. And that was a profoundly important decision. As my former Harvard colleague, Tom Schelling, said in his Nobel laureate address, if Truman had made a different decision, the world would look very different today. What Truman did was establish the nuclear taboo, which is that nuclear weapons are for deterrence, not for warfighting. And think of how different the world would be if nuclear weapons become normal warfighting weapons. So in that sense, a moral decision by Harry Truman had profound historical consequences. So to answer the title of my book, Do Morals Matter? Yes, indeed, if you take the cynical view that morals don't matter, you're going to get history wrong. Well, if we've established that morals do matter historically, not always, not with all presidents to the same degree, but if we establish that they matter, then how should we think about them? And that is an area which I'm really most interested in the book. And having read PPE at Oxford and having done my mandatory paper on moral philosophy, some of it sticks with me yet. And what I try to argue there is that when we do moral reasoning, we can't take simple intuitive answers or simple one-dimensional answers. For example, there are a number of people who say, if we do it, it's good, or if our intentions are good, it's good, or if it turns out well, it's good. But these are really non sequiturs in moral reasoning. And the argument that intentions are enough is often answered by the proverb that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So, for example, when Ari Fleischer, who was George W. Bush's press secretary, was justifying Bush's moral actions as president, he said you had to admire his morality because he was intending to bring democracy and freedom to Iraq when he invaded Iraq. And now that's a debatable proposition, but let's grant it for the minute, just for hypothesis' sake. It's still not an adequate defense of morality. Let me give you an example. Imagine a case of a road accident. Suppose that somebody says they will pick up your daughter and bring her home from a party because you know she has exams the next day, and your friend says, I'll make sure we get her home early. So he picks up your daughter at the party. He wants to get her home early, so he's driving extra fast. He doesn't pay enough attention to the fact that it's rained and the road is slippery. The car skids off the road. Your daughter is killed. A horrible, immoral consequence. You wouldn't say, oh, that's okay. He had good intentions. You'd say, no, he wasn't thinking of all three dimensions of morality, which is intentions, means, and consequences. So grant him good intentions for the sake of argument, but on means, he didn't pay attention to the slippery conditions of the road and the excessive speed under those conditions. And in terms of consequences, it was culpable negligence. He didn't do the due diligence he needed to think through the prospects of unintended consequences, which could be highly immoral. So if you apply that to Bush in Iraq in 2003, and even if we grant the good intentions that Fleischer claims, Bush didn't pay enough attention to the means. We didn't have the means to bring democracy to Iraq or peace to the Middle East. And we did have the means to remove Saddam Hussein with our hard power, but that was the easy part. Actually bringing democracy to Iraq was beyond our capabilities. And the other thing that Bush didn't do is he didn't pay attention to the warnings to that extent. The State Department and the intelligence community had written a number of papers saying that this was going to be difficult to do. Bush ignored those papers. And the net result in terms of consequences of his failure to do due diligence was the American intervention in Iraq strengthened al-Qaeda in Iraq, which then led to basically the Islamic State, ISIS, which in turn had horrible immoral consequences both in Iraq and in the region as a whole. So in that sense, we have to think of morality in foreign policy in what I call three dimensions, 3D morality, intentions, means, and consequences. So with intentions, you ask not just the question of whether there was a noble vision, but also was there prudence in terms of adjusting the vision to reality. You ask in terms of means, was there proportion to discrimination in the use of force? You ask also, was there respect for institutions and rights of others? And in terms of consequences, you ask, was the president a good trustee? Was there attention not just to, in this case, American interests, but also other people's interests? And finally, what was the educational effect? Did it raise moral discourse or lower it over time? When I look at the 14 presidents, I come out with 4 that I put in the top tier, which would be Eisenhower, Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, and the first Bush, George H.W. Bush. And then 4 I put in the bottom tier, which would be Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon because of Vietnam, and George W. Bush because of Iraq, and Donald Trump because of his amorality, his total lack of interest in morality, including the fact that, according to the Washington Post fact checkers, he told something like, 20,000 lies in his first year in office. Well, that amount of lying, all presidents lie at some point, but that amount of lying essentially debases the currency, destroys trust in international relations. So I would argue that morals do matter. They matter historically. And we have to learn to think better about morals as we make our judgments. Finally, I end the book with a chapter on what are the moral challenges in the future. And there I say that there are 2 great power shifts going on in this 21st century, horizontal and vertical. The horizontal power shift is traditional. It's a movement from west to east in the world economy. This is sometimes called the rise of China, but even more, it might be thought of as the recovery of Asia. If you look at the world in 1800, half the world's population was Asian and half the world's economy is Asian. By 1900, it was still half the world's population, but only 20% of the world economy. And I think what we're seeing in this century is a return to what you might call normal proportions. But that raises enormous problems or questions about how do we manage the relationship with China in particular to make sure it doesn't break out into violent conflicts, such as Europe experienced in 1914 when German power challenged British power, and you wound up with the catastrophe of World War I. The other great challenge morally in the 21st century, in our time, is what I call the vertical power shift from governments to non-governmental actors. And there, it's not that governments are displaced, it's that the stage has become more crowded. And in a world with cyber interdependence, with artificial intelligence, with robots and drones and so forth, and with large companies like Facebook and Twitter and so forth, the power to do things is much more dispersed. And then the question is, what's the moral obligations that both presidents and individuals have in such a world? So I hope that by looking at the 14 presidents since 1945 and judging their records by three-dimensional morality, I've laid a basis for us to think about these new moral issues that we're going to confront in the 21st century. In any case, let me end it there and turn it back to you for our discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye. Can I just encourage all attendees to continue to submit questions? I see a couple of questions in our Q&A function. I'll get to those at the end, but please do continue to submit them as we continue to discuss these issues. My first question, Professor Nye, is that you've characterized Roosevelt, Truman, Bush Sr., and Eisenhower as the most moral presidents. Do you think it's becoming harder to be a moral president in this period of unipolar hegemony, and why do you think it is that more recent presidents are acting less morally?
Well, I think the problems of acting morally have always been difficult. It depends to some extent on the circumstances. I don't think things have gotten that much more difficult. For example, when Bush 41, the first President Bush, when he was presiding over the end of the Cold War, and the Berlin Wall came down, people said to him, "You should celebrate this. You should crow that this is a great victory." And Bush's comment was, "I'm not going to dance on the wall. I have to negotiate with Gorbachev." That was a profoundly important moral decision based on prudence. And that's the kind of decision which remains relevant. His son, unfortunately, didn't follow the same sort of advice. But I don't think it's that the circumstances have gotten that much more difficult. I think when you have a president who has good contextual intelligence, he understands international relations, he has more capacity to make that type of decision. And that's what's encouraging about Biden, which is that he's been around. He may not be flashy, but he has great contextual intelligence from years and years of working on foreign policy.
Leading on from your comments about Biden, you've called Trump an amoral or lacking any morality in his foreign policy. But do you see any positives from Trump's foreign policy, or any policies that you think that Biden should continue?
Yes, I think Biden will continue probably the most important of Trump's policy innovations, which was to toughen our position on China. Basically, there's a growing disillusion with China in the United States in both political parties, a feeling that China had stolen intellectual property, had used coercive methods to force companies to give up intellectual property, was giving subsidies to state-owned enterprises, all the time claiming that it was a developing nation and therefore should be treated with kid gloves. It built bases in the South China Sea, which it said it wouldn't militarize and did. So in that sense, there was already a feeling that we hadn't been tough enough on China. Trump changed this. He changed it in a clumsy way. He put tariffs on our allies as well as on China. Biden, I think, will continue the toughness, but will do it in a much more polite and predictable way and with allies.
On the topic of China, critical theorists often dispute the use of terms of morality by Western foreign policy theorists and international relations theorists, arguing disputing who controls the use of these terms. Do you think that terms such as morality can be used in application to Chinese foreign policy? And do you think that the West has an obligation to act morally towards immoral, to states that it deems immoral?
Well, we can make our own moral judgments and act accordingly, even if China doesn't agree with them. There are certain areas, for example, if you look at China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, of trying to destroy their culture, locking them up in internment camps for re-education and so forth, where we can state this is a violation of human rights. Now, China may say, well, we interpret the Universal Declaration of Human Rights differently than you do, and therefore we don't see it as immoral. And we may have a difference in which they'll say it's one thing, we'll say it's another thing. So it's not, even when you have declaration of human rights, it's not as though everybody will interpret human rights the same way, but there's no reason that we shouldn't stand up for our view of human rights. And China, in turn, can properly criticize some of the policies on inequality or racial justice in the United States. So there are differences, and the differences will come out. And that foreign policy can't be pure moralism. After all, foreign policy is trying to accomplish many objectives at the same time: security, economic, human rights, and so forth. If you had a pure human rights policy, you wouldn't have a foreign policy. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that foreign policy shouldn't be part of it. Let me give you an example of that. In 1940, Winston Churchill faced a terrible moral dilemma when the British were pushed into the sea at Dunkirk, and it looked like the Germans were going to take over the French Navy. And Churchill felt he couldn't defend the British islands if Germany got hold of the French Navy. And so he bombed the French fleet and killed 1,300 French sailors. You say, oh my gosh, what an awful thing to do, bomb your own ally. And under those circumstances of pure survival, lifeboat ethics, as it's sometimes called, things happen that you could say are the three dimensions of morality that I mentioned. The consequences overwhelm everything. But with Donald Trump, when the Saudis killed Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist, in their Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Trump's reaction is, well, it's too bad, it's a bad world out there, but we need to sell arms to the Saudis and buy their oil. And even the conservative Wall Street Journal editorial page said, no, we have to also stand up for values. Doesn't mean you bomb Saudi Arabia, but you could have a statement from the White House saying that this is unacceptable. You could have a withdrawal of the ambassador for consultations. You could even stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia for the war in Yemen, whatever. But the argument that Churchill or that Trump treated the murder of Khashoggi as equivalent to what Churchill faced in 1940 is just inadequate moral reasoning.
Thank you. Moving to the issue of the COVID pandemic, the pandemic has quite significantly led to a period of inward-looking domestic policy making. And of course, many people would argue that this has led to a reduction in our means, despite the pandemic ironically being caused by global interconnectedness. When we see this when we look at the shutting of the borders, vaccine provision and conflicts on that, and even the response to the economic crisis. Do you think that the pandemic has reverted us back to kind of realist international order? And have we really abandoned the shackles of liberal internationalism and the ability to act morally into the 2020s? And maybe, do you think we can only come back in a few decades' time to morality?
Well, I think that under the Trump administration, the United States did indeed turn its back on this. The question is not whether you define your national interest as something which is your obligation. It's how you define your national interest. Give you an example. In 1948, Harry Truman defined the American national interest as giving away 2% of our gross domestic product to Europe to help Europe recover. Now, that was good for Europe. It was also good for the United States in preventing communists taking over in Europe. But the point is, instead of defining the national interest narrowly, as we did after World War I, saying to the Europeans, you pay back the money you borrowed from us, we actually gave more money. So that's an example of how you define the national interest can have a very moral content to it. In regard to the pandemic, Trump's definition was purely national in this narrow sense, transactional sense. What he could have done is said, I will stay in the World Health Organization. I will join the COVAX facility of providing vaccines to poor countries that otherwise can't get it or can't afford it. And I will realize that if we're living in an interdependent world, it's good for me, but it's good for them at the same time that we try to stop the virus all over. And essentially, that's what Biden has done. He's rejoined WHO and he's rejoined the COVAX facility. I'd like to see even more. I'd like to see a Marshall Plan for providing vaccines to poor countries. But in any case, there's an example of ways in which, even in a difficult world post-COVID, you can define the national interest narrowly, or you can define it broadly.
In your recent book, you talk about the threat that climate change poses, and the how this intersects with the issue of morality. Why do you think there has been so little progress on the issue of climate change, despite, as the theory of complex interdependence ought to tell us, the international system is predisposed to act, and with moral actors such as the United States, we really ought to have some more progress? And are you optimistic about summits like COP26 this summer?
Well, states and governments have a lot of inertia. They react slowly and much too slowly for the size of the problem we face. On the other hand, there has been some progress. It's interesting, if you look back at 2009 at the Copenhagen conference, the US and China, which are the two largest producers of greenhouse gases, were at total loggerheads. By 2015, at the Paris UN conference, the US and China had agreed on a framework in which you had national declarations, in which you would take actions to cut back on your production of greenhouse gases. Unfortunately, Trump pulled the US out of that. Biden has put us back into it. What we have to do now is ramp up that progress. And the fact that there's a greater public awareness in democracies is, I think, a healthy sign that maybe public opinion is changing on this. It's also interesting that markets are changing. When General Motors, the largest US automobile company, announced 2 weeks ago that they were going to go to all electric cars by the 2030s, it was a huge change. So there is change going on. We just have to speed it up.
And looking at change that's happened in Britain recently, the current British government seems very confident about prospects for a global Britain, talking about trade with the Commonwealth and an Anglosphere of partners with Britain at the forefront. Now that we've left the EU, what are your predictions for Britain's place in the world? And do you think by rejecting the EU, an institution of a liberal institution, have we lost soft power, and are we deluded about how much we even had in the first place?
Well, I think, it's for Britons to decide, but I think Brexit was a mistake in terms of British strategy. When you were in the EU, you had leverage on the Europeans, and you had leverage as a partner with the Europeans across the Atlantic. And that puts you in a very nice spot. Um, by leaving the EU, you lose a lot of that leverage. Now, you can say you've gained independence, but you're still subject to a number of the laws and a number of the economic influences that come from your interdependence. So I don't think Britain is de facto more independent as a result of Brexit. In the meantime, it's lost the influence that it had inside of Europe. And certainly in terms of its influence in the United States, it's not more influential for having left Europe. There is still, contrary to conventional wisdom, there is still something of a special relationship based on language and history, but I don't think it's been strengthened by Brexit. I think it's been weakened by Brexit. I think the interesting question now will be, if one is thinking of a grand strategy for Britain, is how do you preserve the influence you have? And Britain does have a good deal of soft power from its democracy and its culture and its traditions and history. The question is, how do you preserve that and how do you maximize it? And I would say staying close to Europe is one of the ways in which you do it. In other words, getting into open disputes with Europe or distancing yourself from Europe isn't going to increase your influence. It's probably going to decrease it. But anyway, that's for Brits to decide, not for outside Americans. But as an analyst of international politics and as somebody who is as a former Rhodes Scholar, I consider myself a victim of Britain's soft power, since I'm a bit of an Anglophile. That's the advice I would give if asked.
Do you think that then the entire concept of interdependence and liberal institution is a bit of a fickle concept and dependent on the whims of individual players, the hegemons, the USA, the UK, and what sort of governments we get and what the British people or the American people decide to pick? Or do you think there is a coherent international philosophy or a trajectory or a teleology that we're heading towards?
Well, you have to distinguish different types of interdependence. Some types of interdependence you can reduce and should. For example, I think allowing a company like Huawei to control American or British fifth generation telecommunications infrastructure is a huge mistake. That interdependence will be manipulated by the Chinese government for Chinese purposes. That is a case where you should deliberately decouple that interdependence. But contrast that with climate change. You can't decouple interdependence and climate change. It doesn't matter whether you have Donald Trump or Joe Biden. You can't decouple the fact that what will happen to flooding of American coastal areas from melting of glaciers has nothing to do with the personalities of Trump or Biden. And similarly, when you talk about pandemics, viruses don't care about the nationality of the humans they kill. They don't look for the border where they decide whether they're going to kill a human or the nationality. And therefore, we've got to cooperate in areas like pandemics or climate change. So the argument that somehow we'll turn our back on interdependence, yeah, it may make sense in a case like Huawei, particular security-related economic interchange, but it doesn't make any sense when you talk about ecological interdependence. So in that sense, the argument that some people were writing, oh, we passed the age of interdependence, sorry, that modern technology of transport and communication means that's not going to happen.
And last question from me. It's one that we've been asking all of our speakers this term. What's one thing that you think that we should be worried about or thinking about that we aren't enough at the moment?
Well, I would put two things there. One is we should continue the thoughts that we have about preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear non-proliferation, The Economist, I'm interested to see in the last week's issue, put it on the cover, which was a healthy thing to remind us that a world in which you have a wide spread of nuclear weapons is going to make a higher probability of their use. And that would be a true disaster. So that one thing is, I don't think we've been spending enough thought to the issues of non-proliferation. The other one, though, I think we're going to have to spend more time on ecological disasters such as climate change and pandemics. We haven't seen the end of it.
And now we're going to be moving on to questions from our audience. So we have Tasta McCoy Parkhill, a PPE graduate from Oriel. Would you then agree with inaction equally having immoral weight? What's your view on Obama withdrawing from Syria in this moral framework?
Well, the Obama withdrawal from Syria is a hotly disputed moral issue. The question, I think, would be, if you put it to Obama, and if you read his memoirs, you'll see that he does wrestle with this, is whether if he had engaged or gone in, he could have solved the problem. And I think he decided he couldn't. In other words, he tried to engage in Libya using military force with a UN Security Council resolution, with the support of European and Arab allies, and it didn't work. They didn't follow through enough, and Libya is in difficult circumstances today. I think Obama's feeling was that if he could have had a short and easy intervention to have stopped Assad's brutalities and the civil war, yes, it would have been immoral not to have done it. But if in trying to intervene, he would have simply strengthened the Islamic State by showing that Western imperialism was, as they've described it, it might have made things worse. So one wrestles with these counterfactuals, and as Obama says in his memoirs, he wrestled with these counterfactuals, and he felt that the decisions he came up with were, in fact, the right decisions morally, though not happy decisions.
And from an anonymous attendee, doesn't Trump deserve a high grade because he didn't start any wars?
Yes, in fact, when you read my book, and there's a little scorecard I give to each president, and the scorecard for Trump on the issue of means, the second dimension, and particularly the role of the use of force, Trump was relatively prudent in his use of force. And so I do give him a high score on that. Unfortunately, it's negated by the low scores he gets on most of the other questions that I mentioned about his intentions and consequences.
And we have a question from Jan Black on climate change. How do you see morality in foreign policy in relation to climate change? There have been many discussions about historic moral obligations of Western countries to the rest of the world. To what extent do you think this view is justified?
I think that we do have a moral obligation to do something about climate change. I don't think that just seeing it in terms of who put what molecules of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in the 19th century or 20th century is the right way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is, how do we make sure that we're not putting too many in the atmosphere for our children and grandchildren looking into the future? And China, for example, now produces about 40% of the greenhouse gases. And it often looks back and says, yes, but you did it in the 19th century with your industrial revolution. True, and that gives us, or makes some obligation or additional obligation for us, but it doesn't let China or us off the hook for what we need to do now. I think it's more an intergenerational equity question, and we have to look forward to the issue of how are we going to slow this down, and how are we going to prevent it having dire effects on another generation. So you can look backwards, But I think the real moral obligation is future.
And kind of moving on from that, a question from Edward Reynolds asks, how does the issue of imperfect or impartial information potentially complicate the ability to act morally?
Well, that's a crucial question, because in complex issues like foreign policy or many social issues, knowing the full consequences of your actions is virtually impossible. There are all sorts of things that are going to happen that you can't foresee. So how can we hold people responsible for unforeseen consequences? Or is it a sufficient moral excuse to say, well, I couldn't have seen that? A case of this might be Jimmy Carter's effort to rescue the hostages that were held in Iran in 1980, where he sent a team to try to rescue the hostages. They got involved in a sandstorm, and the plane bumped into a helicopter, which led to an explosion and fire. And the problem, some members of the rescue group were killed, and the whole mission was aborted. You could say, Carter could not possibly have foreseen that, and therefore he's exonerated. That's a simple example, but a harder example would be something like I mentioned earlier of George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. You could say, well, Bush did not expect to see the strengthening of al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the rise of ISIS and the horrors that ISIS committed against various peoples in the Middle East. So he can't be held accountable for that. But then you get to a point there where, if this were in a court of law, you would say, but did he do due diligence? Did he pay sufficient attention to the prospects of unforeseen and unintended consequences? And if he didn't, then we would say he's guilty of culpable negligence. In other words, just to say I didn't see it, therefore I didn't intend it, is not adequate defense morally, if in sense you're guilty of failure to do due diligence and culpable negligence.
How do you think the notion that states can have ulterior motives when trying to act morally, with the Bush example, especially with oil interests in Iraq, do you think that that complicates the ability of states to act morally, whether or not they're acting in their own interests and acting, and do you think that states can act altruistically?
Well, I think you'll find that most behavior is in a state's interest. But the question is, can you mix altruism with it? Go back to my Marshall Plan example. Sure, the United States was helping Europe in its own self-interest, but it was helping it in a way that was helping Europe too. And so I think we shouldn't ask for statesmen to act against their national interest. After all, in democracies, they're elected to reflect the interests of their population. So a statesperson, woman or man, who is a leader, has a responsibility as a trustee or fiduciary to the people who elected her. But there's a difference between saying that you defend the national interest and how you define it, how broadly you define it. And I've been suggesting that you can add elements of altruism into the mix. So even if you have some things that are narrowly self-interested, you can then ask also, but did you also include the interests of others? Did you make an effort to include the interests of others?
We have a question from Sean Cooney from Christchurch. Do you think that the challenges facing modern international institutions, particularly the lack of capacity to compel action from great powers, with great powers subsequently ignoring institutions, and how many emergent security issues are protected from resolution by sovereignty, can be resolved within the current institutional framework, or is it no longer fit for purpose?
Well, I think we have to be realistic that this is not going to change anytime soon. If the idea that sovereignty is going away and governments are going away, I think is a utopian idea. Remember in 1996, John Perry Barlow, who was a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, celebrated the rise of the internet. He said, "You weary titans of flesh and steel, we're creating an empire of the mind. We declare a declaration of independence for cyberspace." That was pure utopianism. I mean, what we see is that cyberspace brought companies, it brought wealth, it brought economic progress. With that, you get criminality, and for protection, for security, you want governments. So the argument that we're banishing sovereignty by new technologies or new changes is not going to happen. So the question then is, what do we do with the institutions we have? And I think we try to use them as best we can and supplement them with networks of institutions. So, for example, the UN Security Council, when there is a veto by another country, means that you can't do something. But on the other hand, the existence of the norm in the UN that you don't take your neighbor's territory by force led to sanctions against Russia when it took Crimea from Ukraine. And those sanctions have been costly. And what's interesting is the norm, which is embodied in the UN Charter, people say, oh, well, it's been violated. Yes, but it still is interesting that there hasn't been a lot of taking of your neighbor's territory by force. And in that sense, it's a very different world, let's say, from the 19th century or the 18th century when Frederick the Great wanted Silesia. He took it from Maria Theresa of Austria because he wanted it. That was it. He had the capacity, he took it. The world today is different from that. So yes, these institutions aren't fit for purpose in the sense that they're not really governing cyberspace. We're going to have to find new norms and institutions for that. But it's going to be a slow process of trying to put together webs of institutions, and institutions not just informal intergovernmental structures like the UN, but in networks which can accomplish coordination of coping with interdependence in many areas, even if they don't have formal supranational authority.
We have a question from the Treasurer, Aditya Jabral at St. Hugh's College. Thinking about three-dimensional morality further, would you say it's moral to adjust the value of intention based on consequence? For example, if someone dropped a banana peel and someone else just sprained their ankle, we might be willing to take their intention not to harm at face value. However, if it led to a more serious injury, we might be tempted to disregard intention, even though the error made is the same.
Well, it's an interesting hypothetical. If your intention in dropping the banana peel was simply to discard some waste, and you didn't want to be bothered to carry it till the next trash bin, you say, well, that's a bad intention in the first place. I mean, it's so if somebody comes along and slips on it and breaks a leg, you are culpable. You had bad intention, and the consequences redound against you. If your intention in dropping the banana peel, suppose you knew that there were going to be certain malefactors or robbers who were going to be rushing down this pavement, and you decided to drop several bananas or banana peels to slow them down so they didn't escape, then your intentions would be good. And if the policeman who was chasing the robbers actually slipped on the banana peels and broke his leg instead of the robbers breaking their legs, you'd say, well, we'd exonerate him unless there was, again, this prospect of culpable negligence. In other words, if you could have known that putting that many bananas down was not going to just stop robbers, but might hurt the police as well, then we might not let you get away with it. So you can do games with intentions, but essentially you get to sometimes the games look a little bit too cute or too tricky.
We have a question from a member of Secretary's Committee, Francesco Coppola, at Brasenose College. Do you believe that the West is witnessing democratic backsliding as a result of the rise of populism in continental Europe? Do you believe the decadence of democratic values will ultimately lead to the emergence of more cynical and immoral political leaders?
Well, I do think that we've had a bad spell in a democratic West in terms of the effects of populism, particularly on truth, and with truth comes trust. Speaking for the United States, the fact that Trump used populism, the populism was there, he didn't just create it, but he fanned the flames or exacerbated it. And the fact that he used essentially the methods of reality TV, in which work very well on social media. You try to be more outrageous, because when you're outrageous, the camera follows you. And when people are trying to respond to your last outrage, you're on to the next outrage. And so you control the agenda. That type of populism combined with social media technology, I think, is a real threat to democracy. And it came to a head, of course, when Twitter canceled Trump's privileges at the end after the populist riot which stormed the US Capitol. And we have to think through ways in which we preserve freedom of speech, but where we also set limits on algorithms which make their money from essentially luring people further and further into extremes. So I think there is a threat to democracy, which is a combination of populism and the new technologies. And we haven't sorted that out yet.
And from an anonymous attendee, regarding the UN Security Council, how do the actions of President Clinton, which contravened the UN Security Council decision on the intervention in Yugoslavia, fit within your moral framework?
Well, it's a good question, because if you go back to 1999 and Kosovo, you had in Slobodan Milosevic, the dictator in Serbia, an effort to basically solve the Kosovo problem through ethnic cleansing, which Clinton decided should not be permitted, and on human rights grounds. And but the Russians weren't going to allow a UN resolution under Chapter 7, which is the only formal way in which you can use force unless it's self-defense. Clinton and the NATO allies, including Britain, said, well, there is a moral standard here that we have to live up to, even if we can't meet the legal standard. So the intervention in Kosovo and the bombing of Serbia to get Milosevic to stop the ethnic cleansing were justified as morally legitimate, even if not legally legitimate. The trouble with that is it sets a precedent, which is which then who decides whether this is or is not morally legitimate? And I think that in retrospect, you could argue, yes, Clinton thought he was making a moral decision to help the Kosovars, but the precedent that was set regarding bypassing the Security Council and Chapter 7 was a difficult precedent, and it came to haunt us later.
And just one final question from Akash Rana. Leaders in the future will have to be adept at handling fast-moving, complex environments. and have a clear sense of the intricacies of modern conflicts and confidence to act with clarity. How, if at all, could the leader continue to exercise his moral ethics whilst being dependent on others at every level of the decision-making process?
Well, leaders have to be seen in the context of their followers or in their societies as a whole. If a society does not care about the morality that a leader is exercising, then essentially you're going to get a lowest common denominator. This goes back to the question we had a minute or two ago about populism. If in Western societies we fail to pay respect to truth, if lies become common, if the types of exaggerations that we saw with Trump's behavior becomes the common standard, then when leaders act immorally, we have to say, wait a minute, these were products of immoral followers. So in that sense, we all have a role in trying to raise the standards of our societies and our standards of how we treat truth, and in turn, how we hold our leaders accountable. So it's a good question.
Thank you very much, Professor Nye, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight, and thank you for your great questions. For those of you coming to the meet and greet, I look forward to seeing you shortly on our Zoom link. Once again, thank you, Professor Nye, and have a good evening.
Nice to be with you.